Hey there, happy Friday the 13th. My name is Paul and I'm here to present another quadruple feature for your viewing pleasure. This week though, we're going to do things a little different. I actually have 3 quadruple features planned, one on Thursday, one on Friday the 13th, and one on Saturday, because this week we are going to be going into all 12 of the Friday the 13th films. So this marks week 35 since the country originally shut down 8 months ago, and when that decision was made, it was actually our last Friday the 13th. So never did I imagine in the 8 months that would follow on our next Friday the 13th that things would actually be exponentially worse than they were when the country originally decided to shut down for this pandemic. In fact, as of yesterday, the coronavirus has had an all-time high record number of cases confirmed, 150,000 cases. Yesterday, California also reached the 1 million confirmed cases mark, the second state to do so after Texas. So things are not looking much better than they did 8 months ago when we originally decided to shut down, but now everyone's kind of pretending like this pandemic is no longer a thing and that they should be going out to eat and doing all of these things that aren't really safe to be doing. So continue to social distance and wash your hands and wear a mask, and hopefully we can get to the end of this at some point once everyone decides to actually start taking it seriously. Friday the 13th is one of my favorite days. It's not really a holiday, but I love celebrating Friday the 13th. In fact, before this pandemic happened, I would celebrate them with friends by watching Friday the 13th movies, but we're going to be doing that. We're going to be doing that alone this week, but I'm going to share that joy with all of you. So we're going to go over in depth each of the 12 Friday the 13th films. I'm going to talk about some other movies as well, some TV. We're going to talk about the music from the series. We're going to talk about a few books as well. So I have a lot of information to impart, as well as my views on each of these films. Hopefully you find it entertaining. Hopefully you learn something. Hopefully you get some recommendations to go watch in your own home. I'm also going to go over my 5 favorite kills of the series. I know there are dozens and dozens and dozens of kills that have happened, but I'm going to go over what I think are the 5 best of the series kind of as we get there. We're going to go chronological. Now, Friday the 13th is definitely one of the most important slasher films ever made. But there are a few slasher films that came before it that are equally important, if not more important. In fact, I would say the 5 most important slasher films that came before Friday the 13th that allowed Friday the 13th to be what it is, the first 2 slasher films came out in 1960. One of them was Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, which was a film from the UK, and one of them was Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. These were the first 2 films that you could consider slasher films. They kind of had the formula that we recognize for slasher movies today. At the time, nobody really knew what these very strange movies were, so they were both very controversial. Psycho was a huge hit. It was the biggest hit of Hitchcock's career. Michael Powell's Peeping Tom was actually so controversial that it wound up kind of ruining his career. He only made a couple more movies after that. But those 2 movies, you can consider them sort of the grandparents of the slasher genre. So those 2 movies are very pivotal for laying the groundwork to what was to come for slasher movies. 14 years later, in 1974, we got the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now this one is really important for a few reasons. It's the first one to give us a slasher icon that is instantly recognizable, that would go on through a whole franchise with Leatherface. The filming of this one was also very influential for horror up until today. Very cinema verite style. It was almost like news documentary footage the way they filmed it. What you saw in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974 was reminiscent of the type of footage people were watching on their TV coming back from Vietnam. That's what they were watching on the news. That was the style of filming that they used for Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So it was very gritty and intense, and it felt very real. It didn't have that normal movie sheen that you saw in most cinematic films prior to 1974. Also in 1974, we got Bob Clark's Black Christmas. That one is reminiscent of Peeping Tom because it puts you in the POV of the slasher, so you actually see through his eyes as he's climbing up the wall of the house and peeking in, and you hear these really creepy phone calls that are happening. That was also the first one that was set around a holiday, which, as we're going to cover, became like a staple of slasher movies all through the 80s. Holidays became a really big thing to set your slasher film around. So Bob Clark's Black Christmas was the first one to do that in 74. 4 years later, we got John Carpenter's masterpiece, Halloween. Now, this is probably the most important slasher film that's ever been made, because that one was such a monumental hit that it was replicated and mimicked for years to come. I mean, up until today, people are still ripping off John Carpenter's Halloween. So those 5 movies are the 5 most important slasher films to come before Friday the 13th. From 1980 to, the early 2000s, there were an incalculable amount of slasher films after that. But we are going to start at 1980 with Friday the 13th, which is arguably the most important slasher franchise that has ever existed. And we're going to be looking at the new Scream Factory box set. This box set, in and of itself, is a miracle to exist. Fans never thought they were going to get all 12 Friday the 13th movies boxed together, because the various films are owned by various different companies and they never really want to work together. We're going to cover all of that kind of legal issue that they have in this discussion as well. So Friday the 13th was written by a guy named Victor Miller, and it was directed by a guy named Sean S. Cunningham. And Sean S. Cunningham had been making films for a while, and the films he had been making were softcore pornos and family-friendly adventure-type movies. He wasn't really making them for the artistry of filmmaking. He was making them to try to make a profit. And he wasn't having a lot of success with either of those two types of films. And then he paired up with Wes Craven and produced his directorial debut called Last House on the Left. And he realized, okay, maybe I should be focusing more on horror. Halloween came out in 1978. That was a huge hit. After seeing the massive success of Halloween, says, okay, yeah, we definitely need to do a horror movie. We need to do it just like that. So they essentially just purely rip off Halloween, even down to like the kind of holiday theme. So he says, we need to pick another spooky day. What's another spooky day? Friday the 13th. Okay, so they don't have an actual concept for the movie. They don't have an idea. They don't even know if anyone's going to be interested in that. So before a script is written, Sean S. Cunningham takes out an ad in Variety. All it says is, from the producer of Last House on the Left, and then some generic thing like, comes the most terrifying film you've ever seen. And then just big Friday the 13th. That generated a lot of interest. So that's how they were able to raise their funds, which were not a crazy amount. It was like $350,000. So a very low budget. But they jumped into the movie and they made Friday the 13th. The reason Friday the 13th is an important addition to those 5 films is this one is basically the one that finalized the tropes of the genre. This is the film that turned slasher movies into morality plays. So the camp counselors that are getting murdered in this movie, they're getting murdered because they're not doing their jobs, because they're having sex, because they're doing drugs. Back in the 50s, when Jason was a little boy at Camp Crystal Lake, he was swimming, he wasn't a good swimmer, he drowned because counselors were fucking around, doing their own thing, doing drugs and having sex with each other. So in the 80s, when this movie comes out, when it takes place in modern day, the killer comes and is punishing all of the camp counselors that aren't essentially doing their job very well. So that's how they turned these into morality plays, which was a trend that kind of went through slasher films for most of the 80s as well. The other reason that Friday the 13th is really important is because unlike the other films, which are relatively bloodless, I know Texas Chainsaw Massacre has a reputation as being a very brutal film, but it's just an intensely made and performed film. There's almost no blood in the movie. You never see a chainsaw like penetrating someone. You don't see the special effects, the gore. You don't really see it in Halloween either. Friday the 13th was the first slasher movie to put the special effects and kills and gore and blood up front. They became the most important thing happening in the movie. They really wanted to focus on all of those murders. So that became another staple of slasher movies, was the practical effects, the gore effects that audiences really wanted to see. So Sean S. Cunningham was wondering who they could get to do the special effects. And at the time, the biggest special effects gore movie that had ever been made was Dawn of the Dead, which came out in 1978, a couple years before this. So Sean S. Cunningham went to special effects maestro Tom Savini and got him to do the special effects makeup. So that really created a whole renaissance of slasher film prosthetics and makeup, and each movie kind of pushes the envelope further and further for what they can show. By today's standards, it's relatively quaint because you're seeing some of the most extreme, disgusting practical effects on like The Walking Dead and Hannibal, and TV shows are showing stuff. But slasher films at the time were really pushing the envelope for what you could show as far as violence goes in movies. Another thing Friday the 13th did was it structured its movie more like an Agatha Christie mystery. It was a whodunit. You didn't know who the killer was, and that kind of became a template that slasher films would follow as well for a long time. Not all slasher films. So like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you know it's Leatherface. Later on in the Friday the 13th franchise, you know it's Jason. On A Nightmare on Elm Street, you always knew it was Freddy. For Halloween, you always knew it was Michael Myers. But for most of the other slasher movies, it was always a mystery as to who that killer was going to be. So, you know, if you've seen Scream, you know that the actual killer in the original Friday the 13th is not Jason. Jason's mother, Pamela Voorhees, she's actually not named for a number of films. She's just Mrs. Voorhees. But she's actually the killer that's going around murdering these people. And she was played by Betsy Palmer, who was a very famous stage and television actress. And she was a very kind of wholesome performer. She had never done horror. And so she plays this killer who's murdering all these people. So that actually, I really love horror, especially for like actors, because it's so welcoming. And as far as acting goes, all roads lead to horror. If you are acting long enough, you probably either start in horror movies or you end in horror movies. And horror always kind of welcomes different types of performers in, and it will have roles for older people or actors that are having drinking problems. You know, like Mickey Rooney in the fifth Silent Night, Deadly Night film, or actors that haven't really been getting a ton of work, like Betsy Palmer in Friday the 13th. So I love horror because it's so welcoming of all different types of performances, and it welcomes in all different types of villains. So she had not really done a fight scene. So she has to have a fight scene with Alice, the final girl. And in it, she was used to, in theater, when she would have to, like, you know, smack someone, they would have to like, actually smack them on stage. So they start doing their fight scene, and then Betsy Palmer, like, hauls off and fucking slaps her. And then Alice, you know, the woman playing Alice is like, oh my gosh, starts, like, crying and tells the director she slapped her. So they had to teach her how they're going to actually pretend to slap and then just add a sound effect later. This was also one of Kevin Bacon's first really big roles. Prior to Friday the 13th, he had a sizable role in Animal House, and then after Friday the 13th, he starred in Footloose, which blew him up into like an international star. So he's never really looked back at the franchise. In all of the documentaries I've seen, in all of the retrospectives, and all of the books I've read with interviews from all of the cast and crew and filmmakers that have worked on these films, he's like the only one that has like never come back to give interviews or really talk about Friday the 13th. I don't know why. I don't know if maybe he sees that as like a blotch on his career, but everyone loves that he's in it, and he gets a nice scene where he's laying on a bed post-coitus after having just fucked someone, and then he gets an arrow through the throat from underneath the bed, which is a nice kill. Victor Miller was the screenwriter for Friday the 13th, and he actually named the kid Jason because he knew growing up a shitty little kid named Jason who was like a tattletale and was kind of nasty and mean to everybody. That's why he named him Jason, which is kind of funny because Wes Craven named Freddy Krueger because when he was growing up, there was a bully in his school named Freddy Krueger. So it's kind of funny that like shitty people ultimately get turned into these slasher villains because the directors were terrorized by them in their youth. Friday the 13th is also notable for its ending. It has a jump scare, which is probably one of the most effective jump scares of all time. It was not in the original script. That was something that came late in the filming. They were trying to figure out what they could do for an ending. And it's one of those sort of infamous scenes, sort of like the SS Indianapolis scene from Jaws, where no one really knows who wrote that monologue, but everyone takes credit for it. So everyone takes credit for coming up with the final jump scare in Friday the 13th, but I don't really know who did it. Obviously, it was inspired by Carrie, which had come out a few years previous, Brian De Palma's film, that has a really startling scare right at the end of the movie. They essentially were like, we're going to do a Carrie scare. So Friday the 13th was a hit. It was one of the biggest movies of 1980. Empire Strikes Back was the only movie that was bigger than it. It outgrossed The Shining. It outgrossed every other horror film. It made almost $60 million for 1980. That was a hit, especially from something that had like a $350,000 budget. So it was essentially guaranteed that there was going to be a sequel made. Friday the 13th Part 2 was the sequel that came out like 51 weeks later. They really cracked this one out, and this one came out in 1981. I actually really love Friday the 13th Part 2. It's one of the strongest of the series. But how do you make a sequel when you've killed off most of your cast and you've killed off your main villain? Well, they had this jump scare at the end of Part 1 where Jason pops out of the lake. So they were like, okay, well, Jason's going to be the killer, but he's going to be like a grown man. So already the sort of timeline and mythology of Friday the 13th, it's already convoluted. It continues getting more messed up and convoluted as the series goes on, but from Part 2, it's already not really making sense. Because Part 2 takes place just a few years after the events of Part 1. And at the end of Part 1, Jason is like a little kid still, even though he's been a little kid since like the 50s. So that would let you believe that Jason is like a ghost, or that was an imagined sequence. And very clearly, that was supposed to be like an imaginary sequence. But now, a few years later, Jason is a live, human, grown man walking around in the woods killing people. So we're kind of supposed to believe that since he was a kid who died in the 50s, he didn't actually die and he's just been living in the woods ever since. Or something like that. So already the logic is a little strained, but it's a slasher movie and you can't really think of it too much like that. However, Tom Savini, the makeup guru who did all the great special effects makeup for Part 1, he thought it was so stupid because Jason was dead. He was just like a figment of their imagination at the end of the film. Having him in Part 2 was a dumb idea. So Tom Savini refused to come back to do the makeup for Part 2. Instead, he went and did the makeup for The Burning, which in and of itself is a ripoff of Friday the 13th. So he did the makeup for The Burning, and he did an excellent job on the makeup for The Burning, which is one of my favorite summertime slasher movies. But he was not there for Friday the 13th Part 2. Amy Steele is the final girl in this one, and she is terrific. She's young and scrappy, and I feel she, in addition to Laurie Strode, were very pivotal in shaping the image that we have of the final girl. Friday the 13th Part 2 brought on Steve Miner as the director. Part 2 has one of my favorite iterations of Jason. He doesn't have his mask yet. He just wears like a burlap sack over his head, like a canvas sack that's like a pillowcase or a grain sack or something. And he essentially has one eye hole cut in it, and it's just tied around his neck. And he wears these spooky redneck overalls. And I think that's the creepiest version of Jason. I think that's the scariest. There had also been sort of like a sack-faced killer in a movie that came out a couple years prior, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, but Friday the 13th was way more successful than The Town That Dreaded Sundown, so nobody really thought they ripped it off from there. I don't know if they did or not, but it almost felt like the sack was just a placeholder until they came up with something better. But the sack is what he wears for all of Part 2, but it's one of my favorite looks for Jason. Friday the 13th Part 2 actually has my favorite kill in the franchise. It's a guy named Mark, who's actually in a wheelchair. And to make matters worse, Mark is about to get laid, and the girl who's going to have sex with him has just run to go change, and he's just sitting on a balcony right next to a stairway, and he's just chilling, kind of waiting for this girl to come back, and he hears a noise, and he's like, hello? And then he just takes a machete right in the face, and he rolls backwards, and then he rolls down a flight of stairs. And I guess it's sort of a controversial kill, but also I love it because it really establishes that Jason does not give a fuck. He is going to kill everyone he encounters. Any kid that shows up at this camp is dead meat. And it doesn't matter if you are very attractive, sexy Mark who's in a wheelchair, he's going to get you too. He is an equal opportunity destroyer, and he's going to kill everyone. And I love that kill because I think it's really just ruthless, and it lets you know that Jason is not fucking around. So Part 2 is another hit. It winds up grossing like 21 million, which is very respectable. It was not as much as the first one, but it was still a hit, and they moved ahead into part 3. So Friday the 13th, part 3, brings back Steve Miner as the director, making him the only director that has helmed 2 entries in the franchise. And Steve Miner is a really important character in all of these movies because he was the one that was making the film that brought Jason on as a killer with part 2, which is one of the most important moves that's been made for the franchise. And he's the one directing the movie where Jason gets his iconic hockey mask. So this one comes out a year later. They crack out another sequel. This comes out in 1982. And this one was filmed in 3D. Now, 3D was not really popular at the time. It had been a gimmick that was going on in the 50s. So Creature from the Black Lagoon, House of Wax, a handful of films had been filming in 3D in the 50s. And it was sort of profitable, but not profitable enough to keep going. So it kind of died down. In 1982, Friday the 13th Part 3 films in 3D, and they were using really groundbreaking technology, and they were the first horror film to come back and shoot in 3D, which then kind of spawned like a glut of 3D films through the 80s. But this was the first one to do it. And some of the 3D effects are really cheesy, like someone's using a yo-yo and the yo-yo is going straight to the camera, right? Friday the 13th Part 3 is more focused on like the goofy 3D fun. It wasn't particularly scary. It doesn't seem like it was focused too much on the kills or taking the slasher horror aspect of it too seriously. What Paramount had to do, because this was like the first 3D movie that was coming out in the 80s, is they had to retrofit hundreds of movie theaters. They had to provide them the technology to be able to screen the movie, which then helped all of the horror movies that were released in 3D after that, because those movies didn't have to pay those theaters. And I'm actually very excited about the new Shout Factory collection. The most exciting aspect of it to me is that this is actually a true 3D transfer. Before now, the only way you could watch Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D was with those shitty anaglyphic red and green glasses, but this is a true 3D transfer. If you have a 3D TV and a 3D Blu-ray player, you can finally see Friday the 13th in 3D the way it was actually intended, which I've never been able to see before, so absolutely jazzed to be able to see this one in 3D. And this is the film where Jason gets his iconic hockey mask. What's kind of funny about that is in 1982, Jason was not the only character wearing a hockey mask. There's another sort of slasher horror film that came out in 82 called Alone in the Dark, which is actually fantastic. It's a really great movie. That also has someone in a hockey mask. And Mad Max 2, aka Road Warrior, the main villain is also in a hockey mask. And that one is a classic as well, but the hockey mask became iconic and recognizable for Jason forever and always. Anytime you see a goalie hockey mask, it's Jason that we first associate it with, rather than Lord Humongous from Mad Max 2. So the original concept for Friday the 13th Part 3 was they were going to bring back the final girl from Part 2, Amy Steele, and it was going to be her in a mental institution recovering from the attack that happened. And then Jason shows up at the mental institution and starts killing all of the patients. So they were sort of plugging it as Friday the 13th meets One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I thought was a pretty cool idea. But Amy Steele, for whatever reason, decided not to return to the series. So they went with a different concept, which is essentially the same thing as parts 1 and 2. It's just they're at the summer camp and Jason is back killing people at the summer camp. It also has a character named Shelly, who is, without a doubt, the most obnoxious character in the history of Friday the 13th. He's the worst character. Most people can't stand Shelly. And Shelly is actually, in an ironic twist of fate, he's the character who brings the hockey mask to the lake with him, and he scares someone in the mask and then takes it off. Jason finds that mask and puts it on. So the reveal of Jason's iconic mask is always a little bit tainted with the fact that Shelly is the annoying-ass character who provided that mask for him. It's a little cheesy. It's not as good as the first two, but it's fun. It's almost wholesome in the way that it depicts its characters for the first hour or so. It doesn't have like an unrelenting body count like the killing that happens in the first two films happens quick and consistently. This one there's a little bit of a wait before it gets to some of the kills, so it lets you settle in with the characters. Unfortunately, most of the characters aren't really that great. You don't really want to settle in with most of them. So the working title for Friday the 13th Part 2 was simply Jason. Friday the 13th Part 3, the working title for the movie is from a David Bowie song. They call it Crystal Japan because they started having code names for the productions because they were very popular when they were coming out, and so they kind of wanted to keep them secret. The release of Friday the 13th Part 3D is a massive hit. They make like $36 million, and they actually bump out the number one movie in America out of its number one slot, which was E.T. So Friday the 13th Part 3D, the 3D gimmick was a gamble that really paid off for Paramount, and that, of course, ensured that they were going to do a fourth Friday the 13th movie. Paramount, however, thought that was going to be their last Friday the 13th film. They thought that it was going to run out of juice at that point. So they called it Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. This was the fourth one. Now, since they thought it was going to be the final chapter, Tom Savini comes back to do the special effects makeup. His view was like, I birthed Jason, and now I'm going to be the special effects guy to kill Jason. And his special effects are some of the best that he's done. The movie is directed by a kind of genre exploitation filmmaker named Joseph Zito, who had prior success a couple years earlier with The Prowler, which is one of the grittiest and grungiest and sleaziest slasher movies of the 1980s. And it's really great. And Tom Savini had done the special effects on The Prowler as well. And they were really intense. He did really crazy special effects on The Prowler. So I highly recommend checking that one out. So Joseph Zito and Tom Savini bring kind of a much needed grittiness and seriousness back to Friday the 13th after it goes a little campy for Part 3. So the final chapter, directed by Joseph Zito, and he does a really great job. He bordered on softcore porn with some of the movies that he made. So he really ups the tit quota in the movie as well. There's a lot of nudity in the movie, but this movie is also noteworthy for bringing on Corey Feldman, who he essentially plays the lead in the movie. He's like a kid in the film. And 1984 was a really big year for Corey Feldman because that was the year Gremlins came out as well. So he was quite the little budding star. And normally when a kid is introduced into like an adult movie, right, and a kid's gonna save the day or be the hero or be like a main component, that usually rubs me the wrong way. But Corey Feldman is actually terrific, and he never really pulls you out of the film. It never makes it feel like they're making a movie for kids or anything like that. This movie also has the Doublemint twins. If you remember those Doublemint gum commercials from the 80s with the two cute twins, they're in this, and they're revealing it all as they go skinny dipping and as they get murdered by Jason. I think this one is a really great Friday the 13th movie. This one is a really great slasher movie. In fact, I go so far as to say this is one of the greatest slasher movies of all time. This is my favorite in the series. And this is a lot of people's favorite in the Friday the 13th series. It's just a really quality slasher film. It's suspenseful, it's scary, and it has really great visuals. The way they film Jason in the dark, it looks great. Part 3 is like very bright and overly lit, and it all looks like it's like in the daytime. This one actually looks like a dark, rainy, scary movie. It's also noteworthy for Crispin Glover. Crispin Glover is one of the wildest, craziest, most unpredictable performers, and he's in Friday the 13th doing some particularly amazing dance moves. He has a dance scene where he's supposed to dance with a girl, and the filmmakers did not know what he was going to do, and the dance he busts out is truly amazing. It's one of the weirdest dances that you'll ever see, but Crispin Glover, he just adds kind of a really interesting element to the film as well. And he's probably the biggest star to come out of the Friday the 13th series after Kevin Bacon. Those two went on to have like global success, while most of the other performers through the entire franchise are kind of relegated to their fame of Friday the 13th, even though some of them would go on to do other stuff. This cover art, the Jason mask with the blood on it and the knife, they there was like two companies kind of working on the cover art that they were going to advertise on the one sheets in movie theaters and stuff. And each group thought the other one had submitted it to the MPAA for approval, and neither of them actually did. So they just released all of these posters, and then basically movie theaters around the country were like, we're not putting that like bloody mess up in our theaters. That's too violent. So they had to recall all the posters and then do them without the blood. But now that's how they advertise it now. Friday the 13th, the final chapter, also has one of my favorite kills, one of my top 5. So this is the second one that I'll list for the top 5 kills. This one is someone gets killed in a basement, and they had done special effects and like you see it originally the way they filmed it, but then they essentially cut it all out, so you don't really see any of the murder. So there's a guy kind of walking around in a basement, and there's a woman at the top of the stairs kind of like, are you okay? What's going on? What do you see? And then Jason kind of pops out from behind him, and he's like, there's someone in here! Get out of here! Get out of here! And then you just kind of see Jason cover him and start, presumably stabbing him or whatever. So you kind of see it from like a wide shot, from like far away at the top of the stairs. You kind of see him getting murdered. Why it's such an effective kill, I would go so far as to say it's probably the most effective murder in the entire franchise, is because the guy is screaming for help in the most realistic, frightening way. And this is going to sound silly, but the way he's screaming for help is he's saying the dumbest shit that you would only say if you were getting murdered. So he's literally saying, like, he's stabbing me, he's killing me, get out of here, get out of here. And something about it is kind of funny and silly, but also something about it rings so true. Because when you're in a situation where you're really hurt or where you're really scared, you say the most obvious, stupid shit. So him screaming, he's killing me, the first time I saw it when I was a kid, it sent chills down my spine, and I still think it's a very, very effective murder. In fact, last summer, not the summer that just happened where we were quarantined, last summer I saw the final chapter in a movie theater, and it was a very rambunctious crowd, and everyone was having a good time and cheering and everything like that. And that was like the only moment in the movie where the audience was like pretty silent, because it's a very chilling murder. Even though you don't see anything, it's all audio. That one's really effective. The final chapter introduces a character who's looking for his sister, who's either been killed or gone missing. He's looking for his sister, Sandra. And Sandra was actually a character from part 2. She's actually one of my favorite characters in the whole series. She's really cute. She has hair that kind of looks like mine, but it's a lot longer and curlier. She basically just wears like Daisy Dukes in a bikini, and she walks around in hiking boots, and she doesn't have very many lines, and she gets murdered, in part 2. She gets shish kebabbed while having sex with her boyfriend, just a spear straight through both of them as they're fucking on a hammock, and it's a pretty good kill. She's such like an unpivotal character in the series. Until part 4, when her brother shows up. But the timeline doesn't really match, but at least they're trying to do their best to tie it all together. Not that any of that really matters. So Friday the 13th, the final chapter, was not the final chapter. It's another hit. It grosses about $33 million, and it once again just ensures that Paramount does in fact want to do another sequel. Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning. But how do you make a new Friday the 13th movie after you have definitively killed Jason, after you've promised the audience that Jason is going to die and deliver on that promise? How do you do it? Well, at the end of the final chapter, they sort of allude to the fact that Corey Feldman is going to kind of catch Jason's crazy, and that he's gone nuts, and that maybe he's going to become the next slasher killer. And Corey Feldman was originally going to star in part 5, but Steven Spielberg wanted Corey Feldman for The Goonies, and he sort of was forced to do it. Even though he wanted to do another Friday the 13th movie, he like had to go do The Goonies, which obviously was going to pay him way more and make him way more of like a worldwide movie star. He still is in the opening scene of Friday the 13th part 5, and he's like seeing 2 people digging up Jason, and then Jason like becoming resurrected, and then he wakes up and he's an adult. So years have passed. Corey Feldman's character Tommy Jarvis has become an adult. So do you remember I told you the original concept for Friday the 13th part 3 was going to be Friday the 13th meets One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in a mental hospital. They took that abandoned script and kind of cannibalized it and rewrote it. So now Tommy Jarvis, as a young adult, he's in sort of like a halfway home for like wayward teens. This is one of the least popular Friday the 13th movies because they try to go back to the original concept of sort of like a whodunit. So at the end, they reveal that the killer, I won't tell you who it is, although it is the most fucking obvious thing in the world when you're watching the movie. But at the end, when they reveal that the killer is a character in the movie, and in fact, not Jason Voorhees, audiences hated it. They turned against Friday the 13th Part 5 in a very similar way that audiences turned against Halloween 3 when it came out and didn't have Michael Myers in the film. This one was one of the most reviled in the series. The director that they brought on, Danny Steinman, this guy was, so I said Joseph Zito kind of did like softcore porn and there was a lot of nudity in Part 4. Danny Steinman was like a straight up porn director. And you can feel it in the movie. Like, Friday the 13th Part 5, more than any other of the films in the franchise, this one almost feels like a porno. The dialogue the characters have with each other, it's very centered around them fucking each other, and it's very unrealistic. And then there are sex scenes, and the focus is purely showing girls with big tits. Like, that's the main focus for this director. There's a scene where a girl is just lying in the woods topless, and they got so much fucking coverage on that shot of her laying down. It was ridiculous. So this guy, his focus was showing some boobies in this movie, and he delivered on that. In fact, this guy was so focused on titties that there was a character who was going to be cast in the movie, and she was pretty far along in the audition process, and then they found out that they actually got an audition with a Playboy model and then immediately cut that girl, brought the Playboy model in, and cast her in the role. She's now like an elementary school teacher and a poet. They also sneak a little film reference in the movie. There's an actress who is standing in front of a mirror putting on her makeup and she's about to go meet up with her boyfriend. In the movie, she's just directed to like flash herself in the mirror. So just like show her tits, which doesn't really make sense. I don't think most people would just kind of like pop them out just to look at them themselves. But she had seen All That Jazz a number of times and she really loved it. And through the whole film, his kind of mantra, as Bob Fosse is, it's showtime. That's what he always says to himself in the mirror. So she says, hey, when I flash my tits, is it cool if I say, it's showtime? I think it's funny that the actress that they cast to just like pop her tits out and then get murdered was actually sort of a cinephile who had more refined tastes in films. The MPAA, which is the board of people that watch a movie and decide what rating it's going to get, they tell a studio, this is going to get an X rating unless you cut out these scenes, unless you cut out 10 seconds of that scene, 5 seconds of this scene. They make a list. The MPAA, it has been established, is essentially like a group of housewives and mothers that live in Encino. So it's people that don't really have any cinematic appreciation. It's just people that are easily offended. And the Friday the 13th films essentially became the poster child for bad movies. Movies we need to cut the violence out of. And Part 5 is really where the MPAA starts tightening the belt with what they're going to allow. So while there's violence in the other films, like a significant amount that was chopped out, Part 5 is where they essentially start cutting out everything. So there are some of the murders in this movie that are so disjointed. The way they had to cut around all of the violence, which is really a shame because there are, professional makeup people that come in and spend a lot of time and a lot of money getting these effects to look right, and to have their portion of the movie essentially cut out entirely, it's really not fair. And unfortunately, for several of these Friday the 13th movies, including Part 5, we're never gonna have a true director's cut with those scenes restored. Because back then, they were filming all of these movies on film. There was no digital filmmaking where it's just a file that you put onto a hard drive. It was literal film that you had to store safely. Film takes up a lot of space. So a lot of times when there's film you don't use, it winds up getting destroyed. The studio's not going to hang on to everything. So unfortunately, Paramount went ahead and gave the permission for all of the trimmed scenes to be destroyed. So the actual physical hard copy of so much of the trimmed scenes from the Friday the 13th series have been eliminated. There are some where it's been restored, like Friday the 13th, the original one is like uncut, and parts 9 and beyond you can find the uncut versions, but from 5 to 8, they brutalized these movies as if it was a teenager in one of the films. I mean, they just cut the fuck out of them. In several of those instances, it's just gone forever. You can't find it because the actual footage was destroyed, which is unfortunate. Not that I think Friday the 13th Part 5 is the best in the series. In fact, it's one of the weakest. It's kind of fun, but the characters are really obnoxious. Almost all of them are obnoxious. The dialogue is insanely bad. There's a character right before he dies. He's like hooking up with his girlfriend, and then he just suddenly, this is one of the most famous lines in the whole franchise. He suddenly goes, "Oh, damn enchiladas!" and like runs to an outhouse, and then he gets murdered in the outhouse. But the explanation for like getting him to the outhouse was just this really bad line of "ooh, damn enchiladas," which is pretty funny in hindsight, and it's like a famous line. But I can't imagine being an actor whose legacy is essentially being tied to the line "ooh, damn enchiladas," because, you know, people screamed that at him for years and years. There are almost 24 death scenes in A New Beginning, but most of the violence in them has been trimmed down. So technically there's like one of the highest body counts of the entire franchise, but it has like the least amount of gore. The working title for A New Beginning was suitably Repetition, and the stuntman for Part 4, who portrayed Jason, was offered to come back and play Jason again, and he thought the final chapter was a piece of shit. He didn't think anyone was going to see it. He was embarrassed of it, and so he refused to come back for Part 5. Now he says he regrets it because it was the most noteworthy thing he did in his career because the franchise is so popular now. But he refused to come back for Part 5, so they had to cast a new Jason. He would have been the first stuntman to play Jason multiple times if he hadn't refused, but he didn't. Of course, it was still a hit, and audiences were still coming in off of the success of Part 4, which everyone loved. So everyone came to see Part 5, but it really pissed audiences off. So by the time Part 6 came around, audiences didn't turn out for that one. So the negative reaction of Part 5, even though it was a success, hindered Part 6. Now, something that I think is pretty cool about the Friday the 13th franchise is that the movies were so popular. When they were casting the films, they had these fake titles that they would film under. The teens and like young people that were cast in the movies, they wouldn't even tell them it was a Friday the 13th movie. They just thought they were getting cast in some random horror film. It wasn't until they actually showed up on set and literally saw Jason walking around that they realized they were in a Friday the 13th movie, which would probably be an undeniably exciting thing to realize, oh, I'm not just in a movie that's going to be immediately forgotten, I'm going to be in a movie that's going to be forgotten by most people except for the diehard fans. After Friday the 13th Part 5 is another success, Paramount makes another sequel, Part 6, but they think, okay, we're going to learn from our mistake of like depriving the audience of actually having Jason Voorhees in the movie. They straight up in the title call it Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. So they want audiences to know Jason is back. They bring on a director named Tom McLaughlin. He wants to inject some humor into the movie, and he's basically told, okay, that's totally fine, just don't make fun of Jason. Tom McLaughlin was a former mime turned filmmaker, and he, in 1986, is the first filmmaker to inject self-awareness into the series. And it adds like a much needed cleverness to the franchise that you hadn't seen before. There's like a James Bond opening, which is sort of bizarre for the series. It's self-referential. They have a character breaking the fourth wall, directly referencing the audience. They have tons of movie references to like other horror films. So it's just a lot of fun in other ways that Friday the 13th movies weren't usually fun. So it has the kind of fun slasher aspect, and it has kind of an aware comedy to it as well, which obviously became very popular in the 90s, but this is one of the early films that kind of had a self-awareness to it. Jason Lives got better reviews than every other Friday the 13th film, and aside from Part 4, you'll find that Part 6 is general audience's favorite of the series. And it's my second favorite. Mine go 4, 6, 2 are my top 3 favorites. But Jason Lives, I think, is really great. It's funny, but that never really encroaches on the scares. The way they film Jason looks really good. And kind of keeping with the David Bowie song title for a secret filming name, they called this movie Aladdin Sane, which was the name of a David Bowie song. And Tom McLaughlin, he loved rock music, and he got Alice Cooper to come on board and do 3 songs for the movie. So they were really pushing on making Friday the 13th Part 6 even cooler than the average Friday the 13th movie. So there was a music video that was kind of playing in regular rotation on MTV. He's back! The man behind the mask. That's how the song goes. I'm not a singer, but it's pretty cool. It adds like a certain level of fun. The characters are all pretty enjoyable, and Tommy Jarvis is back for his 3rd movie. So parts 4, 5, and 6, if you don't want to watch the whole franchise, they effectively work as their own trilogy, the Tommy Jarvis trilogy. He's a kid in part 4. He's like kind of a crazy adult in part 5. And then they kind of do away with that a little bit in part 6. He's more well-adjusted, but he is driven on killing Jason. The movie starts, and what Tom McLaughlin also does is he injects like a really nice gothic atmosphere into the movies. He was very influenced by like the classic Universal monster movies, so the style of the film is much more kind of artistic and dark and spooky than the rest of the Friday the 13th films. So it shows up with Tommy Jarvis digging up Jason and then grabbing like a pole off of a fence for the cemetery and stabbing it into Jason, and kind of in an homage to Frankenstein, he gets struck by lightning, and the lightning is what brings Jason back. So his own drive to kill Jason, who was essentially dead and resting in the ground, is what brought Jason back. So Jason, he's back, and then he just starts fucking people up. This is actually where the series takes like a more supernatural turn. So this is where Jason becomes like an otherworldly monster, or sometimes he's referred to as zombie Jason. But that's the difference between the first 5 films and the rest of the films, is now Jason is this unstoppable sort of ghost monster because he's been resurrected by lightning. And now the series takes more of a supernatural turn, where in parts 1 through 4, they legitimately try to make him like a human man that's killing people. Part 6 is like, no, now it's a monster. Probably the most noteworthy, not my favorite in the series or even in my top 5, but probably the most noteworthy death in Jason Lives, which, was injecting comedy into it, was there was a group of people that were out in the woods paintballing, and there's 3 people that got shot with paintballs, and so they had to put on a bandana that says dead. So they have dead written across their foreheads, and all 3 of them are walking, and Jason's in the woods, and they turn and they see him, and then in one swoop, dunk, 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 he decapitates all 3 of them with one swing, and all the heads roll on the ground. So that one's a pretty cool death. The movie's a lot of fun. This one flies. It's like under 90 minutes. It's the fastest pace of the series because it starts right off the bat. The way it introduces the characters amidst the action is very well done. It's never boring and is pretty smart. And it was the first one to actually get good reviews. Unfortunately, it was the lowest grossing of the series at that point. Because fans were so disenchanted after part 5, people didn't turn out for part 6. And it still did okay, but it premiered at number 2 at the box office, the first in the series that didn't capture the number 1 spot its opening weekend, because in a summer of sequels, audiences couldn't get geared up enough for Friday the 13th. So there was like, what was there? There was like Poltergeist 2, Psycho 3, Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, and the juggernaut that demolished all of them that wouldn't relinquish its number 1 spot in 1986, Aliens, the biggest sequel that happened, the biggest horror sequel of all time. And it couldn't take the number 1 spot from Aliens. So Friday the 13th Part 6, even though it was getting better reviews than all the other movies and is arguably one of the better films of the series, underperformed worse than all of them. It grossed less than $20 million. Any horror franchise has the law of diminishing returns, so each one makes a little less than its predecessor, but still, Paramount thought there was some more to wring out from Friday the 13th, so they moved on to part 7. Okay, let's take a quick break from going through these movies chronologically to discuss a couple different mediums. Now let's talk about the music a little bit, as well as some TV. So I'm gonna stop and talk about the music here because Jason Lives was actually the last full score that Harry Manfredini did for Friday the 13th. So if you go back and watch my great movie scores episode, I talk a lot about the Friday the 13th music and play some, but Harry Manfredini did a tremendous score, really one of the most iconic horror movie scores. So he actually did the scores for all of the first 6 movies. And of course they get a little repetitive and similar because we want those famous themes. So then he tries to spice it up and change them around. So for example, Friday the 13th in 3D, that one has like a disco theme, which has become very famous as far as horror movie music goes. But he did the music for Final Chapter as well. And Waxwork has done really amazing job with all of the cover art that they've done for these. And Jason Lives was the final full Manfredini score that he did for one. So the next movie, New Blood, he's still credited on because they still take so much of what he did. And I think he might have had a hand in composing some of the scores, but they bring on different composers from this point on. So this is the score for Part 7, The New Blood, which is going to be the next one we talk about. But that was essentially the exit of Manfredini from the series as far as the music goes. But the musical contributions are so integral for what Friday the 13th is. So I just want to take a moment to talk about some of the scores he's done. And again, Waxwork has done such a tremendous job with those. In fact, today they're dropping the score for Part 8. For Jason Takes Manhattan, they're releasing the score right now. I'll also stop here and take a moment to talk about, which came out around this time, the TV series for Friday the 13th. This was a show cashing in off the title, and the show ran for, I think, 3 seasons, and it was a hit. It actually did really well, even though not one episode featured Jason. Friday the 13th, the TV series, Paramount TV released it, and it was about like an antique shop where all of the items are cursed. And so every person that goes into the antique shop will get an antique, buy it, and take it home, and then have their own crazy story involved with that antique. So it was an anthology series, but still linking together a few crucial characters, one of the people who works in the antique shop turns out to star in the 9th Friday the 13th film. So he's the only person to cross over between the series and the movies. The TV show ran at the same time as Freddy's Nightmares. So Nightmare on Elm Street had its own TV spinoff, which was very similar with kind of an anthology series, and Freddy Krueger was like the host. So those two shows were kind of going against each other at the same time that the movies were kind of combating against each other as well. In 1988, Paramount goes back to the well another time for Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. For this movie, they brought in John Carl Buechler to direct. He was like a special effects guru. He had directed a few other films, but did really great practical makeup effects. And he really takes that to heart with Part 7 because the way he designed and did the makeup for Jason was unlike any of the other films. So this one kind of continues with the more kind of supernatural angle of Jason being this kind of unstoppable monster. But John Carl Buechler incorporates from all of the previous films every wound Jason has gotten. So every time he was fighting with a final girl and he got, a machete in the head, or he got stabbed in the shoulder, or whatever, all of the wounds Jason had through the whole series, they incorporate into his makeup. So Jason is literally a monster in this one. He has huge chunks of flesh missing. His back, you can see his entire spinal column. They did really cool makeup, and they actually show Jason's face, which they had done in a couple movies before, but they had never, and he was always kind of like deformed. He's like a deformed person, kind of like, the Elephant Man. But in this one, they make him straight up looking like a monster. He looks like a dinosaur or a lizard or something when they finally reveal his face. But it's a really impressive makeup job. John Carl Buechler had worked with a guy named Kane Hodder on a movie called Prison. And Buechler, when he came in to, do the casting, brought on Kane Hodder to portray Jason. And Kane Hodder would then go on for that film and the next 3 films to play Jason. So he has played Jason more than any other stuntman, and he has become iconic as Jason. He's easily the most famous person to play Jason. He actually has like burns all over his neck. He did a really bad fire stunt that went wrong a little earlier in his career, but he's still a stuntman, and now in his career he does more acting. He does like kind of characters that are more of a performance than it is like a stunt thing, although he does like a lot of his own stunts for them as well. But he plays Victor Crowley in the Hatchet films as well. But he's easily the most famous stuntman that has played Jason, because he's the only one that's played him multiple times. And he's a fan favorite. Audiences love him. Most people think he's like the best Jason. He might not be my favorite Jason, but he's great, and he brings like an undeniable menace to it. He's really big, so that was the point where Jason started becoming like a behemoth. But he does like a really great job in that one. So the concept for Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, to sort of inject some new blood into the movie, they wanted to give Jason an adversary. They wanted to give him a foe that could really battle him equally. As opposed to Jason just coming in and fucking up all of these teenagers, they wanted someone that could effectively fight back, more so than just kind of a witty, resourceful final girl that happens to be very strong. They brought in a girl with telekinesis. So this one was essentially Carrie versus Jason. That was kind of how they were advertising it. Like, Jason has finally met his foe with someone that can fight back. So she can like control him and like lift him in the air and make shit hit him and stuff like that. So this one goes full-blown supernatural kind of fantasy horror, and it's a lot of fun. And I think the cinematography on this one's really good. It's nice and dark and spooky. It looked good. Jason looks great. And this one, unfortunately, was also just butchered by the MPAA, and all of the trims were discarded for this one. So there's never going to be like a full-blown director's cut, which is made even more sad because John Carl Buechler just passed away within the past couple years. But his movie lives on because this is one of the better ones in the franchise, and this one is my 4th favorite in the series. And Part 7 has one of them. We're now up to number 3 on 5 favorite kills. But this one is one of my favorite kills, and this one is probably the audience vote for favorite kill in the entire franchise. This one is discussed more than almost all of the other kills in the whole series. Jason, he kills a guy who's in the woods, and his girlfriend is waiting in the tent in a sleeping bag, of course, waiting to have sex with him. Jason cuts through the tent, and she sees him in the sleeping bag, and she's like, ah! And then she crawls down into her sleeping bag, and he takes the sleeping bag, and he smashes it against a tree like a bag of oranges or something. And the MPAA ruthlessly cut that scene down because it was like a bag of blood that they had in there. So he's smashing it against the tree multiple times, and the sleeping bag gets all bloody. They kept saying, take out more wax, until it was finally cut down to literally Jason whacking it once and she dies. But Kane Hodder argues that like the force of one whack killing her makes it feel like a much more ruthless kill than doing it multiple times. But that one is one of the most famous kills in the series. The New Blood came out in theaters, and it didn't even break 20 million. It was like a little over $19 million is what it grossed. It came out the same year as A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, The Dream Master, which just crushed Friday the 13th. Dream Master grossed like $49 million. Friday the 13th was on its way down, A Nightmare on Elm Street was on its way up, and it seemed like, one of the death throes for the Friday the 13th series, but Paramount decided they were going to try to wring out just a little bit more, make one more sequel, and that's when they did Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. This one came out in 1989, and this is the last official Friday the 13th film from Paramount. So their run ran from 1980 to 89, 8 movies. Very impressive decade for Friday the 13th. So Jason Takes Manhattan. They decide, if this is going to be the last one, let's go out on a bang, and let's fucking get Jason out of Crystal Lake already. We've had 7 movies where he's been in the same location, killing people in the same way. Let's go big or go home. Fuck it, let's take Jason to the Big Apple. So the original concept that they had was Jason basically in New York in all of these iconic areas, like on famous bridges and in Times Square. In the Empire State Building, there was going to be a murder scene. And in Madison Square Garden, he was going to punch someone's head off. And they had all of these like really fun ideas mapped out. And then the studio said, okay, well, you're not going to have as much money as we thought. So you have to cut down a few of those. You're only going to have X amount of days in New York. And they said, okay. And then they said, actually, you're going to have even less than that. You have to trim out more filming days in New York. You're not going to get this location. You're not going to get that location. So then they said, okay. And then eventually they were like, you know what? You're going to get one night in Times Square, and that's all you're going to get. You're essentially going to get one scene. So they shot the shit out of this scene in Times Square, and that was like the whole advertising campaign was like, Jason goes to New York. He's going to run rampant through the streets of New York, killing all of these people. Jason Takes Manhattan is my least favorite in the series because it just absolutely doesn't deliver on that in any way, shape, or form. So I actually think if anyone was to remake any of the Friday the 13th films with an actual kind of modern, sizable budget, I think Jason Takes Manhattan is ripe for rediscovery because there are so many possibilities, and it would finally give audiences the movie that they hoped for back in 1989 that they absolutely did not get. So the way they made up for Jason Takes Manhattan, when he was in Manhattan for like essentially a few hours of filming, the way they made up for that was, okay, well, Jason has to get to Manhattan. So there's going to be a boat in Crystal Lake, and he's going to hop on board that boat, and it's going to go to Manhattan. So this one is also like the dumbest for logic as well, because like, oh, Crystal Lake connects to the Atlantic Ocean. Like, okay, no fucking way is that the case. But there's like a little boat, or like I guess like a yacht, and Jason hops on board and he kills a couple people that are fucking on that yacht, and then he's like a stowaway, and the yacht gets rented for like a graduation party. They're all taking a trip to New York. So it's a whole class of people, which you would assume is like 100 or a few hundred people. You only meet like 10 kids, and the boat is very small. They kind of plug it like it's like a luxury liner, but it is really not that. So there's only so many places Jason could actually hide on this, relatively small boat, but at least half the movie takes place on this fucking boat. It's not Jason Takes Manhattan, it's Jason on a boat, and it's very underwhelming. They finally get to New York, and for New York, it's mainly filmed in Vancouver, in like back alleys and on sets, and most people are killed in like an alleyway or a sewer, and there's like a few shots of him in Times Square, which are undeniably great, but it's really frustrating for what could have been had they actually had access to all of these iconic places in New York. Seeing Jason in a different location is just thrilling, but we essentially only got to see him in like sets and back alleys in Vancouver and one shot in New York, which has become such an iconic shot. You see it all the time. The advertising campaign, similarly to part 4 where they had some issues and had to recall the posters, they had the iconic I Heart New York, and that was the poster, but Jason was like ripping through it with like a bloody knife. And New York didn't like that. They didn't like their classic I Love New York ad being desecrated by Jason, so they actually had to take all of those posters back and then kind of release different posters for them. But, I love any Friday the 13th movie, so I'm still going to have fun with it. But this is the lamest, the most logic plot hole one there is, and of course, like all the previous ones, it is just chopped to fucking shit with the MPAA. Jason Takes Manhattan it was brutalized just like all the others, and this was the last of the official Paramount series, the original 8-film run. So Jason Takes Manhattan comes out to middling results. It doesn't really do that well. That same year, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child, comes out and greatly underperforms, especially compared to Part 4. Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 comes out. Whoa! Jesus, that scared me. It doesn't really do that well. And Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, is also released and also doesn't really do that well. So it seems like all of these franchises are really struggling to stay afloat, and that's kind of where you see some of them starting to fall off. In particular, Friday the 13th. After a few years, Sean S. Cunningham, who made the original film, comes back and he decides he wants to helm a Freddy versus Jason movie, which audiences had been clamoring for a few years at that point. But that even the idea of that is still, it's like held up in such a legal battle because the properties are owned by two different companies and they're not going to be able to get a script greenlit for that for a really long time. But he goes and tries to get the rights to Friday the 13th back from Paramount. He's ultimately successful and unsuccessful. Paramount won't give him the rights to Friday the 13th, but they agree to let him make movies with Jason. So Jason Voorhees is still there, but technically they're not a Friday the 13th movie because that is still owned by Paramount and they don't give up that title. So he's over at New Line, right? And New Line owns A Nightmare on Elm Street. So they now have these two slasher titans under the same roof, so they technically could make a movie, but it's still not getting greenlit by the studio. They can't agree on a script. So in the meantime, Sean S. Cunningham says, okay, well, I have the rights to Jason. Let's make a Jason movie. So they make Jason Goes to Hell, which they're once again billing as the final Friday the 13th movie. So it's actually called The Final Friday. And Jason Goes to Hell is probably the most unfairly maligned film in the series. I genuinely love Jason Goes to Hell, and any respectable horror fan is gonna tell me that I'm stupid and that I don't know what I'm talking about because everyone hates this fucking movie. This movie is actually quite good and it's very entertaining. The idea for it is it starts with like a typical Jason type scene where he's stalking some girl in the woods who goes to a cabin and like takes a shower and the lights turn out and then he's trying to kill her and she's running away and then she runs out into the woods and he chases her and then all these spotlights turn on and you realize that it's like the SWAT team's finally getting Jason and then they blow him up and he's dead, and that's how the movie starts. And then the movie kind of turns into more of like kind of a supernatural angle, and the spirit of Jason passes from body to body. So I think it's kind of like a fun body hopping type story, and ultimately it does get back into Jason's final form, but it makes you wait for it. And audiences, after 4 or 5 years, this came out in 1993, audiences didn't want to wait for Jason. So he dies right in the beginning, and then you essentially go for like an hour or so without giving you Jason, and audiences hated that. So you finally get Jason for the final stretch of movie, and I think it's a payoff. When he shows up, I think it's very exciting, and I think it's really great. And I actually remember watching Jason Goes to Hell and Wes Craven's New Nightmare during my brother's birthday. He had rented both of those films, and that's where I saw both of them, and I thought it was a blast. And Jason Goes to Hell ends on one of the most exciting promises in cinema history, with Jason's mask just laying in the dirt, and it's the final shot, and then Freddy's glove comes up and grabs the mask and pulls it down, and then audiences go apeshit because now they finally think they're going to get a Freddy versus Jason movie. Little do they know it will be a decade before that actually happens, because Freddy vs. Jason lingers in development hell for so fucking long before they finally get a script approved. So Sean S. Cunningham he's back, he's producing the movie, and they're kind of advertising it like the person who originally brought you Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th is now the person who's come back to kill him for the final time, is the way they're kind of advertising it. So he produces it, he hires first-time director Adam Marcus to kind of develop this film and make it, and the only direction he gives him is like, get rid of that fucking hockey mask, because Sean S. Cunningham had nothing to do with the hockey mask and kind of didn't like that that's what the whole series became. And Adam Marcus does for a majority of the film, which is actually what pissed audiences off the most, was taking Jason away for the majority of the film. But I actually think the movie is really entertaining. It has some of the most violent kills of the series, because we're in the 90s now, and Jason Goes to Hell does something pretty groundbreaking where they release the movie in theaters, where they let the MPAA chop it, and they release an unrated version on home video. So the kills are way gorier than you've ever seen in the whole franchise. One of the best kills in the series is in Jason Goes to Hell. It's a guy and a girl having sex in a tent, of course. And Jason, he's like walking around the woods. There's like a road sign, and he grabs it, like a stop sign or something like that. So he's walking around with a road sign with this like jagged pole off of it. And in the tent, the girl is like riding him cowboy style. He's like laying down. She's on top. She's fucking him. And as they're in the throes of passion, this signpost, it comes out through her chest, sprays him with blood as he's screaming, and she's like, oh! And then he yanks it up, So it slices her in half, and then her body like falls apart and is spraying blood all over this guy, who then gets killed by Jason. That kill, when I saw it, I was a kid, I was like, holy shit, I was like 10 years old. That was easily the most amount of violence you had ever seen in the entire series. Like, it's a very impressive piece of practical effects. It's disgusting, it's awesome, easily one of the best kills of the entire series. But let me actually hang my sign back up. So New Line still has the rights to Jason, and they still want to do a Freddy versus Jason movie, but it's still trapped in production hell. So they decide, okay, in the meantime, while we're waiting for Freddy versus Jason to hopefully become a thing, let's do another Jason movie. But Jason Goes to Hell ends on the note of the hockey mask getting pulled down by Freddy's glove. So they don't want to fuck up the timeline. They don't want to continue Jason's story in a way they can't take back when they want to do Freddy vs. Jason. So they're like, how do we make a Jason movie to make the end moment of Jason Goes to Hell still the potential beginning for Freddy vs. Jason? So they're like, okay, well, let's just set the next Jason movie, which is the 10th Jason movie, let's just set it way in the future. And then they're like, well, fuck it, let's put him in space for Jason X. Now, if you are a horror devotee, you know that sending a character to space is essentially, that's like your last move. Hellraiser's gone to space, Critters, which kind of works because they're from space originally, but then a movie that takes place in space, Leprechaun went to motherfucking space, James Bond went to space in one of the worst entries of the series, and then they send Jason up to space. I know I said Jason Takes Manhattan is my least favorite in the series. It's actually Jason X, and it's kind of fun, but it is so fucking corny, and it's like too self-aware. It's like having too good of a time, which makes sense because while they were working on the movie, through the script writing phase and through the filming, producers kept coming back and giving them notes saying, make it more like Scream. Scream's the biggest slasher movie right now. Make it more like Scream. So they keep making it more and more self-referential. They keep making more and more little nods and winks to the audience, but in such a ham-fisted, overdone way. There's basically one really clever joke where Jason goes into like a hologram room so they can distract him. And they're like, how are we going to distract Jason? And then they program like two sexy college co-eds who are like, hey, do you want to party? Do you want to drink and have premarital sex? And then Jason spends time killing these two holograms, and that's pretty funny. But like, the movie really tries too hard for the comedy. It's my least favorite in the series just because of the ridiculous sci-fi angle I can't really get behind. And then they have Uber Jason, which Jason gets killed and then he comes back as this like super fucking cyborg robot Jason with a metal mask, and he looks absolutely ridiculous. And in my eyes, that's the moment of like, Jason is too much. He's too big. He's too muscly. He's too ridiculous. And I get a lot of people like it for the really campy aspect, but Jason X, easily my least favorite in the series. That being said, I will now cover the 5th favorite kill of the franchise. Jason grabs a girl, dunks her head in liquid nitrogen, and you see her head. It's like a shot in the tank. Her head comes in, and then you see it like freeze. And then he pulls her head out and he smashes it on a counter and it explodes. That was a pretty good kill. Those are the top 5 kills of the franchise. Other than that, Jason X doesn't really do it for me. But again, it's a Jason movie, so I'm gonna watch it and I'm gonna have a good time regardless. Just not as good of a time as the rest of the films. So when Jason X finally comes out, it does very poorly. It doesn't do well. So it took them about a year to make Jason X, and when it was done, Michael DeLuca, who was one of the heads at New Line, who was like the champion of Jason X, he was the one who really wanted to get it released. He got fired from New Line, so he left. No one else that was working at New Line really gave a shit about Jason X. They weren't really trying to push it forward to get released. So after about a year of making Jason X, it then sat on the shelf for about 18 more months. In that time, a version of Jason X got leaked online. It's been like 8 or 9 years since the last Jason movie. People are excited for it. It becomes the most pirated film of all time. So most of the people that were really excited to see Jason X already saw it by the time it got released. The buzz had sort of died down. it came and went very quickly. It wasn't a good film. And it was sort of hamstrung by this sort of odd release schedule where it took like almost 2 years for the movie to come out. So now we get to 2003 for what audiences have been clamoring for over a decade. They finally agree on a script for Freddy versus Jason. Now this was like the movie matchup that horror nerds were dying for. But they had so many different writers come on board and pitch different concepts and write different treatments, different outlines, different screenplays. They couldn't agree on a story, and every writer was bringing in such drastically different ideas. In fact, they had so many different scripts and so many different ideas. There's an entire book called Slash of the Titans, which is fucking awesome. If you love Nightmare on Elm Street and or Friday the 13th or just kind of film stories in general, this is a fascinating book because it meticulously details every draft, every outline, every treatment, and what exactly they were going to do with the movies. And I think it's fascinating. This was like a super quick read. I got through it in a couple days, but highly recommend Slash of the Titans by Dustin McNeil, who clearly really loves this shit. And it also goes into a very detailed breakdown of what the follow-up to Freddy vs. Jason was going to be, because it was originally intended that Jason Goes to Hell, Freddy vs. Jason, and a third movie were going to be their own trilogy, because Jason Goes to Hell ends with the Claw grabbing his mask, and then Freddy vs. Jason was going to be them duking it out, and then the third movie was going to be Freddy vs. Jason versus Ash from Evil Dead, played by Bruce Campbell. And I read that title, and I thought it was kind of ridiculous, but the treatment actually was really cool, and it solves a huge issue with Freddy vs. Jason, which is you've been promising this matchup for over a decade so that fans can finally see who's going to win in a fight, Freddy versus Jason, but they're not really going to be able to deliver on that because either option is going to piss off half of the fan base. So giving a hero in the story, obviously Ash is going to win, and Jason and Freddy are going to lose in that battle. So it kind of solves a problem of not really upsetting anyone, because Freddy and Jason kind of lose equally, and everyone loves Ash. He's kind of become this cult classic figure in the horror community. He's like everyone's favorite hero from the Evil Dead franchise, which is also a great series of films. So that was what the third one was going to be. But I recommend checking out Slash of the Titans, which goes into meticulous detail about every version of Freddy versus Jason. What they ultimately come down to for Freddy versus Jason, though, is that Freddy is fueled by people's fear, and he's able to go into people's dreams and kill them because people's fear of him gives him that power. It's now been so long since a Nightmare on Elm Street movie's come out that nobody's scared of him anymore. So he goes and resurrects Jason by pretending to be Jason's mother. Palmer refused to come back for this movie because they didn't offer her any money, and she was like, I'm not going to go do this cameo for free with these ridiculous lines. So they cast some other old lady who like wills Jason back to life and sends him down to Elm Street to start killing people, to start getting them scared again. So teens start getting killed down on Elm Street. They start getting frightened, and Freddy becomes more and more powerful, and he starts killing kids. But he wants Jason to stop killing them at that point because he wants to kill them. So now they're both in like a killing competition, and it's an absolutely ridiculous premise, but I actually really like Freddy vs. Jason. And a big part of the reason I like it is the visual style of it. They actually brought on a filmmaker named Ronnie Yu, who was not familiar with either franchise, had never seen a Nightmare on Elm Street movie or a Friday the 13th movie. And you would think that is not the right person to make this movie. But he had made a film that actually got pretty big in America called The Bride with White Hair, which is kind of like a martial arts sort of horror-y movie. And then he got hired to essentially resurrect the Child's Play franchise by directing Bride of Chucky, which was very self-referential and fun and really smart and visually awesome. He's a really great filmmaker. He's got a really nice eye. So they brought him on to do Freddy vs. Jason. And I think he was a good choice, and I think he did a really good job. Freddy vs. Jason is a lot of fun. It was the biggest budget they ever had on one of these films, but it was also the biggest hit out of either franchise. It was also the first Friday the 13th movie to actually get a Hollywood premiere, which is very sad to think of the 10 previous films. All of the people that worked on it, all of the people that acted in those movies never got to walk the red carpet and have a premiere because nobody really took the movies serious enough for that. Even though they were making money and bringing in huge audiences, that's the first one that ever got a premiere. But another sad thing that happened on that is after 4 Friday the 13th films as Jason, Kane Hodder was the biggest champion of a Freddy vs. Jason movie happening. He was going to horror festivals constantly, and he was plugging it, and he was trying to get it to happen. And then when it finally happened, the studio recast him. They said, we're not bringing Kane Hodder back. That one had to have hurt. They did bring Robert Englund back as Freddy. That's a little harder to mask as someone else, but this was the last time that Robert Englund would play Freddy. But Freddy vs. Jason, it's actually a lot of fun. A part of me is very sad that they didn't do the trilogy with Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, but with a third character and with a third studio getting involved, it was just a whole legal battle that was never going to work. And Evil Dead has been having its own legal battles with Sam Raimi giving up some of the rights so that a studio could remake Evil Dead. And then Sam Raimi wanted to make Evil Dead 4, continuing his original trilogy. But then the studio was arguing that he only wanted to because their film was so successful, and so that was held up in a whole legal battle. But they have announced that there's going to be a new Evil Dead movie, Evil Dead Rise, which takes place in a skyscraper in a city, which I think sounds like a really cool concept, and I think that will be a lot of fun. I'm very excited for that when they announce it. But this is Freddy and Jason. So Freddy vs. Jason, it was the biggest hit of the entire franchise, and that's essentially where the original Jason storyline concludes. Those 11 films. There is a 12th movie because in 2009 they brought Jason back one more time. We are nearing the end, I promise. So after Freddy vs. Jason, we go a number of years without another Friday the 13th film. But in 2003, Michael Bay's company, Platinum Dunes, remakes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And it's actually a pretty solid remake. It's certainly nowhere near the masterpiece of the original from '74, but it's a pretty good film, and it is a fucking moneymaker. It makes a ton of money for the amount that the movie cost. And now Platinum Dunes is they're starting to eye other horror properties. So they remake the Amityville Horror in a truly abysmal film, which still makes money. And they're eyeballing Friday the 13th. Because they're well, if we did Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is essentially a holy grail film, that's a film you don't fuck with. And they remade it, and it got okay reviews, and it did really well. Then they're fuck it, we can do anything. So they were all right, we are going to take on Friday the 13th. The problem is those rights are mixed up with New Line and Paramount, and now this is a third company who wants to get in the mix. So it takes them about a year of legal battles before they finally get the rights to do a Friday the 13th movie. So in 2009, we got the last Friday the 13th movie that we've gotten so far. And it's essentially a recap of the first 4 movies. So they recap the first movie with Mrs. Voorhees. In the teaser of the film, in the first few minutes, they have Jason living in the woods as an adult with the sack mask on. They have him getting his hockey mask, killing a bunch of teens. They have the lonesome drifter coming back to look for his sister, like from Friday the 13th Part 4. So it kind of ingeniously rolls up the first 4 Friday the 13th movies into one package. And they recast Jason once more with Derek Mears, who is probably my favorite Jason. I think he is fucking awesome. He physically embodies Jason really well. He's not too big or lumbering. He's really big and he's really fit, but he's also athletic and moves quick. And they have Jason run in the movie, which is sacrilegious. Audiences were pissed off because Jason ran. Horror audiences, the things they get on their horse about. And also is ridiculous because Jason ran in the early movies. In Part 4, he's running after, he has ran before. So they have Jason running, and that's very controversial. And it's just kind of a throwback to the classic slasher movies. Now they do say in sort of a scuzzy interview, we want to get back to the roots of Friday the 13th, which is the murders and the sex and drugs and debauchery. And for a number of Friday the 13th films, they had kind of cut out the nudity. In the slasher films of the 2000s, like nudity had kind of been pulled out of those films because they saw the success of Scream that didn't have any nudity. They didn't really need to kind of keep making sleazy type slasher films aside from the violence, but they were like, we're going to put the nudity back in, and they do. It was a hit. It made about $93 million worldwide, which was the most successful horror remake. It blew away any of the numbers from any of the other Platinum Dunes remakes, and it was really successful. And they wanted to move into a Friday the 13th Part 2. And that's where some of the legal issues really start, because now the rights for Friday the 13th are broken up between so many different companies that all want to do the next Friday the 13th film. So Paramount still has a part of it. New Line does. Now Platinum Dunes, plus Sean S. Cunningham, the guy who made the original Friday the 13th. He has been trying to make a TV show about Friday the 13th, like a Jason TV show. And all of these different companies want to do something different. None of them want to relinquish any of the hold that they have on a property. So it's been now over a decade since the last Friday the 13th film. This is the longest we've had to go since 1980 without having one. This year marks the 40th anniversary of Friday the 13th. So for 40 years, Jason Voorhees has been in our life. He's the most iconic slasher villain. I'm not saying that the movies are necessarily better than Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, or Nightmare on Elm Street. All of the movies kind of have varying quality throughout the franchises, but Jason is without a doubt the most iconic slasher out of all of them. Every kid recognizes like what the hockey mask means. It's like almost more iconic for Jason than it is for the sport of hockey. So we're ready for another Friday the 13th film. I don't know when that's going to happen, but if you love Friday the 13th and you just got to get that itch scratched, I can also recommend Crystal Lake Memories, which is like a 7-hour documentary. And that sounds like, holy cow, a 7-hour documentary, but it kind of meticulously details the production history of all of the films in the franchise. And I know that sounds like, oh, that would be a daunting watch. I've actually watched this like 3 times. For me, this just flies by. Crystal Lake Memories is based off of this massive coffee table book, which is the most in-depth reporting on the Friday the 13th franchise. This book is fucking awesome. He's getting whacked right there with the machete. I love this book. So if you're a Jason junkie, check out Crystal Lake Memories. If you don't like reading, shame on you, but go ahead and check out the documentary that they made about it, Crystal Lake Memories. So we are still waiting on Friday the 13th Part 13. It sort of blows my mind that we haven't had one yet. And I know this seems like a very big franchise, but 12 is not a crazy amount. It is more than almost all of the other slasher movies. Right now, Halloween has 11, but it'll have 12 and 13 within the next couple years. A Nightmare on Elm Street has 9, but like James Bond has like 26. Godzilla has like 35 or 36 movies, so it's really not the craziest size franchise, but it is one that I love and is very beloved by horror audiences everywhere. So that is my episode on Friday the 13th. But for anyone that has made it to the end, the first person to drop into my DMs and tell me my favorite kill in the Friday the 13th franchise, I've got this box set with your name on it. This is the Paramount run of Friday the 13th films. So if you want Friday the 13th parts 1 through 8 on Blu-ray, send me a direct message and answer that question. What's my favorite murder in the Friday the 13th franchise? And this is coming to you. Thanks for watching. I hope this was not too boring. I hope this was not too nerdy of a deep dive. Remember, wash your hands, social distance, and always wear a mask.